Our next speaker is Vitaly Chernetsky, Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Kansas. He is a past president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies and the current vice president and scholarly secretary of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US. Among his publications are Mapping Post-Communist Cultures, Russia and Ukraine in the Context of Globalization, which was published in 2007, and the Ukrainian language version in 2013, as well as Intersections and Breakthroughs, Ukrainian Literature and Cinema Between the Global and the Local, which is forthcoming later this year in Ukrainian, as well as numerous translations of Ukrainian literature into English. Yuri mostly focuses on two films, and Vitaly's title of his talk is The School of War, Identity, Crisis, and Transformation in Two Films on the Donbas Conflict.
The war in Donbass has generated, as we are seeing today at our conference, prodigious response in many different art forms. And well, our first panel focused on literature, and literature in some ways was the first and the fastest to respond. Cinema has also been providing a rich trove of responses to conflict, and my big thanks to Yuri for his insightful presentation that started us on this discussion. While Yuri was focused on a representation of the conflict, mine is going to be focused on slightly different things, and namely on how people try to cope with effects of conflict in terms of their personal identities. In essence, I mean, this is of course something that also happens in the middle of combat, but these two films that I'll be talking about do not present things during combat. And one of these films, Школа номер 3, School Number 3, is a very interesting work in that it is a cinematic adaptation of a work of documentary theater. And the other one, Frost, by the Lithuanian director Šarūnas Bartas, is an interesting example of a international co-production. It's Lithuania, Poland, France, and Ukraine, which tries to combine inside and outside perspective, and in some ways as important is trying to present the war, the conflict in Donbass for the outsider audiences and from the perspective of an outsider who does not on the surface of it have a stake in it, but is trying to figure out why it matters for all of us. So war, of course, is an inherently traumatic experience, and as has been mentioned already in the previous panel, some of the responses can be short and immediate, and poetry and song are very clearly examples of that. But in our technological time, cinematic and video responses have also been immediate. The revolution of dignity was described, I think, aptly by Alexander Mehed as the first revolution that has been live streamed. And indeed, this gave many of us who could not be physically in Kiev at the Maidan in the winter of 13-14, a very interesting and complex and contradictory feeling in that it gave us an illusion of immediacy of presence, even if we were part of the so-called Divanna Sotnya, the couch 100, so those who were trying to help the revolution from very far away in the privacy of their own rooms in front of the computer. There were, however, also lots of people rushing to document it, and the technology has allowed this to be done not just with big bulky cameras, but basically with smartphones. And I think in this respect, one of the most remarkable accomplishments was the work of the Babylon 13 Collective, which is a collective project of a group of Ukrainian filmmakers, younger and mid-generation. Its informal leader is Volodymyr Techich. He was also the former leader of the project Mudake Arabeske that Yuri mentioned. And It starts literally on November 30th with the attack of Berkut on the protesters, and that is the day of the immediate response. And if you go today on the YouTube channel Babylon 13 Project, there are nearly 350 videos there. And some of the works that they've produced are as short as 20 seconds, but they're self-contained short videos. Others are full-length feature films, documentaries. And they span this whole period. Obviously, there are many more works from the Revolution of Dignity and the first year of the war, of the Russian aggression, but there are also, they continue to add new work. In all these identity changes, it's the fracturing of identities in the midst of the sudden separation, but also a unifying of people finding themselves in new communities that is of huge importance. And there are documentary filmmakers who have explored the fracturing, and Vitaly Mansky, who now is based in Latvia, but before that was based in Russia, even though he was born in Lviv, did this with his film Ridni, or Родные in Russian, Close Relations. And this is a film in which he interviews members of his own family, his relatives, who live in Lviv, in the separatist-controlled part of Donbass, in Russian-annexed Sevastopol, and in Odessa. So we get a picture of one family, people who are blood relatives, who found themselves in different parts of Ukraine and who have adapted and created stories that are completely at odds with each other, and they no longer have language in common. By contrast, there are examples of a focus on conceptualization of self that is trying to bring people together. So the first film that I want to talk about is School Number 3, Школа номер 3, which is a Ukrainian-German co-production. The documentary drama was an interesting new development that got its start largely in the United Kingdom and the Royal Court Theatre, and controversially for us, it arrived in Ukraine via Russia because Royal Court playwrights came to Moscow in 1999. They gave a workshop for young playwrights and students, got people interested. There was a start of documentary drama in Russia, the organization called Theater Dok, and several others. In the recent crackdown on independent society civil society in Russia, this has all but been extinguished since 2014. And the two founders of Theater Dok both are dead under mysterious and clear circumstances. So this has been put in Russia to a very violent end. It so happened that a part of this movement were two Ukrainians, Natalia Vorozhbit and Maxim Kurochkin, and Vorozhbit is the better known of the two. She was born in Kyiv, but she studied at VDIK in Moscow and graduated in 2000, and was still based in Moscow for 10 years, so from up until 2010. 2010 is when she returned to Ukraine, moved back to Kyiv. During this time, she actively participated in the work of this new drama movement, and her play Grain Store, Zernohraniliще in Russian, was produced in English in the UK in 2009. And I unfortunately did not see the performance, but I know there are people in the room who have. And this was a major work that brought the tragedy of Holodomor to the attention of British theater audiences to a degree that had never happened before. So it played a very, very important part. One of the co-directors of this film is a German guy with a French last name, Georg Genoux. He was born in Hamburg, and he was active in Theater Doc, but also in other East European theater programs, including in Bulgaria, for example. But he basically, too, was kicked out of Russia and tried to, with the help of Natalia Vorozhbit, see whether they can assist in helping people who have been traumatized by the war, most importantly, the refugees or internally displaced people from the Russian annexed Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine in the part of Ukraine that is still controlled by Ukrainian government. Thus, we have the start of a phenomenon called Teatr Переселенця, Theater of Displaced People, and Zhenu and Vorozhbet are the leaders of this program. This film, however, is not about people who were displaced, who were refugees. This is about people who stayed. This is a small town. Let me advance and show you where it is on the map. I'm not sure if it's clear enough, so you can see, I'm not sure if the pointer works. There's Slovyansk. So this is the city where the separatist, Russian-supported, quote-unquote, separatist aggression started. And there's the small town of Mykolaiivka, about 20,000 people population, right next to it. So Mykolaiivka and that school were important in part because this is a school that was shelled during the conflict. So there was an actual shell that fell into the school and damaged it. So in August 2014, when this territory was regained and was again under Ukrainian government control, a lot of volunteers came to this area. So the Revolution of Dignity was a major stimulus for Ukrainian volunteer movement to an unprecedented extent. And a lot of these volunteers who came from Kyiv, but also from all over the country, came to those territories to make sure that indeed we work to break, to end the fragmentation of the country, which in some ways is very much a colonial legacy in that there were not enough horizontal ties possible between different regions of Ukraine. So now, in the aftermath of Russian aggression, we have had Don Cult and Halitsiya Cult sort of projects where cultural festivals representing one region of Ukraine traveled to another region. There were also festivals representing, I think, Uzhhorod and Slobozhanщина and the other way around, trying to sew Ukraine together, make sure that these attempts to fracture Ukraine along regional lines are not successful. So this particular film is the consequence of that first visit in August 2014, because the local population was traumatized, was shell-shocked, but the volunteers really hoped to help, and after initial resistance of the locals, they talked to them, and so they returned a year later. So the film was actually shot a year after that first visit, so in the late summer, early fall of 2015. And after many interviews, they selected and interviewed and developed monologues for the stage, and on the basis of those created interviews also that we see on the screen of 13 kids who were 13 to 16 years old at the time of the Russian aggression. And this is them telling their stories. In the film, they usually tell their monologues while they're holding an object important for their lives. One holds a motorcycle helmet, for example. One holds a toy of a tourist trinket of an Eiffel Tower. One called a toy monkey. One a toy car. One a piece of the curtain from the window, and so on and so forth. But it becomes part of a long story that is told, and the story starts with the normal and ordinary and mundane, and the trauma enters it suddenly and transforms, and you will see how by the end of the story, this is a new and different person. There is also a complex relationship to identity, and I would not say that this is the geographic-only identity. These are all the children in the film speak Russian. We hear Ukrainian, but this is Ukrainian of Ukrainian music. So volunteers brought to them Ukrainian language rock music, and they became big fans of it. So this is the Ukrainian language we hear in the film. The kids all speak Russian, but they all have strong support of Ukrainian identity. And in fact, one of the young women interviewed, she has this traumatic situation because her boyfriend actually joined the separatists, and he put in front of her a decision. Either those people or me, you have to choose. And she hesitated, but she chose what she associates with Ukraine, which is normalcy as opposed to Russian aggression. It is not a very well thought through position, not a very well articulated, but it is important because as I was thinking of the title, The School of Wars, it also puns a little bit with the fog of war. And this is a very important thing for us to remember, is that while at Maidan Nезалежності, during the Revolution of Dignity, people had very clear views and very clear ideas of why we're there and what they were trying to achieve. By contrast, the local populations in those areas of Donbass, when the Russian aggression started happening, they were not very strongly identifying one way or the other, and they had to come up with and develop their own identities. Serhii Zhadan's novel Internat, The Orphanage, is a great example of a work that actually dramatizes that in the course of the novel, how a person who has no civic consciousness, who wants to be out of politics, who does not want to be involved, is compelled by the circumstances to grow a spine, so to speak, and develop a civic consciousness. These young people also do so in a remarkable way. Here it is. Let's try, with the help of the nice colleague here, see the trailer of the film with the English subtitles. The film at the Berlin Film Festival in 2017 won the Grand Prix in the 14+ category, so films for and about children and young adults.
Опасная зона. Купание запрещено. Ваня, уверен?
Но мы сейчас, кроме Николаевки, ничего и не видели. Что мы сейчас живем такое чувство на том же Марсе, потому что мы и так ничего и не знаем, считай, про этот мир.
У меня недавно был такой случай, я принес виноград с огорода, и мне было жутко все лень делать. Я просто уселся на кухне, помыл виноград и начал его есть. И в этом винограде я увидел жука, при том, что у меня жутко болели ноги, и я просто мог его вот так раздавить и все. Я вот так его взял, отнес на балкон и выпустил с балкона, и он улетел. Мне не хотелось его убивать. Я не знаю, не хотелось. И поэтому ставить вопрос, убью ли я человека, если я не могу убить жука, как-то не ставлю я себе больше такие вопросы.
Именно тот вечер, когда она говорит, что она опять с ним, мне так сразу противно становится, такой жар по лицу, по всему телу, и я хочу уже идти крошить и убивать. Но мне нужно идти на вальс. Да, я иду на вальс, весь вечер наблюдаю за одноклассниками, как они тренируются. На половине занятий выхожу домой, покупаю в ВТБ зажигалку, о которой потом рассказывал. И Весь вечер провожу за тем, что слушаю песни Radiohead. Как обычно, в принципе.
Thank you. So the important thing is that while the film documents them in the process of coming to terms with how their lives have changed, these young people, as participants in documentary theater project and as people who were filmed in this film, they now have different identities of their own. So their story is actually a very happy story in that they were in Berlin, they were at the Odessa Film Festival for the Ukrainian national premiere later the same year. They have developed a new sense. They have stepped outside this small town of Mykolaiivka. They no longer feel like they live on planet Mars. But this is the question is, I mean, can we be very happy for these 13 young people who now have all graduated high school. But what is going to happen to the community at large? Will they be able to be those agents of change that will bring these new kind of Ukrainian identities there? And the film leaves this as a completely open question. In fact, what to me is important about both of these films is that they do not force answers on us. They give us a slice of life information and ask us to debate this and debate things that may be very uncomfortable for us and not to be afraid to debate those things. Moving on to the next film, Frost by Šarūnas Bartas. This is a work that has generated, I would say, a lot more controversy and less universal acclaim compared to School Number 3. Bartas is Lithuania's most important filmmaker from post-communist era. His first film, Three Stories, came out in 1991. And he has been acclaimed as one of Europe's great filmmaker philosophers. He is friends with Jean-Luc Godard. Godard has quoted one of Bartas's films in his own work. So he is part of that kind of a European philosophical auteur cinema. His films are slow. His films often are very dark in terms of, literally, there's very little light. We see there's a lot of unglamorous outskirts of cities and towns, and this is true of works that were made in Lithuania only. And it is interesting to see how this impulse developed, because in the context of Revolution of Dignity, Lithuania became one of Ukraine's most important and strongest allies. Lithuania's president, Dalia Grybauskaitė, was seen as one of Europe's leaders who has articulated solidarity with Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. So perhaps it is not surprising that a Lithuanian filmmaker would create this kind of film with an outsider European perspective. And the film was screened at Cannes in the Quinzaine des Réalisateurs program. It also was Lithuania's submission to the Academy Awards. It did not win any awards, though. It received respectable but restrained press in Europe, and American film media like Variety absolutely panned it. They say it's long and tedious. There is no action. We do not understand these people. What are they doing and why are they doing it? Which I think reflects more the reviewers of Variety than necessarily the film itself. But I would like to contextualize it as this is a film that is in some ways uncomfortable in part because Bartas himself is not sure of the message that he wants to deliver. In fact, the film has been re-edited many times. And so the version that is available on DVD, the DVD in the West is only available in France with French subtitles. So I got mine through Amazon France, is perhaps not the definitive version. The film is interesting in that it is very multilingual. There is Lithuanian, Polish, English, Ukrainian, and Russian. Even though it's a French co-production, we do not hear French spoken. English is a main international language that is used. But in the post-Soviet context, Russian is used. So when the Lithuanian volunteers talk to Ukrainian soldiers on frontline, they speak Russian to each other. So you hear Ukrainian spoken, but this is Ukrainian of Plenakacha Potisini, or this is when we hear the Ukrainian soldiers talking to each other without meaning to be understood by the Lithuanians who are next to them. The plot is relatively simple. A Lithuanian volunteer who has a truckload of humanitarian supplies for Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Mariinka, Kurakhove, and that surrounding area, and the film actually was shot in that part, cannot go for some reason. He asks a buddy of his, can you drive this truck to Ukraine? You're free, you're not doing anything. He's sort of one of those 20-something with no clear meaning of his life. And he says yes. Just on his, okay, I'll do it, without thinking. And then his girlfriend comes with him. So they're not quite sure why they're doing. They vaguely think that this is a good thing that they're doing, that this is for a good cause. And even though they're not strongly invested, they still think that this is a nice thing to do. But the story gets more and more complicated. Things become not as easy. There are various shady intermediaries. The Polish character, played by Andrzej Hira, is not a very sympathetic character, shall we say. He's a shady operator, and it's an example that there are war profiteers in any and each conflict. There is two large scenes in the film that are very, very important, and we do not see much of it in the trailer that we're going to show you, unfortunately, but we hear a little bit. The film is semi-improvised, and some scenes are completely improvised. There are professional actors and non-professional actors. And one of the crucial scenes is that they get to Dnipro, and they need to spend a night in a hotel. And this is a hotel where many foreign journalists that are covering the conflict are staying. And there is some sort of drinking happening in the bar, so our Lithuanians get to talk to Americans, to this European journalist who is played by Vanessa Paradis, who some of you may know as the former partner of Johnny Depp, but she is a very important person in her own part. And she is the star who is on the cover of the DVD and of posters that were released in the West. Notably in the Ukrainian poster, we do not see that. We see Rokas, our Lithuanian character, but we see him upside down, because this trip is something that completely transformed his identity. But we have that long scene, which is completely improvised, or mostly improvised, in what at least the journalists are saying. And some of the American journalists are played by actual American journalists who were covering the conflict in Ukraine. Similarly, when they get to Mariinka and Kurakhove, the soldiers there are also unscripted. They're saying what they feel like saying. And the film just take it as it is. And this is actually something that was praised unanimously by all the reviewers, all the of the film when it was seen at various festivals, that the performance of the Ukrainian soldiers on the front line who were not performing, who were just being themselves, is probably the strongest part of the film. So let's see the trailer, and we'll have then some concluding remarks.
Ne, man atsirado reikalų, tiesiog aš tiesiog turiu likti čia Lietuvoje. Ir man reikia krovinį nugabenti iki Ukrainos šią savaitę. kareiviams. Tai tu nori, kad aš nuvažiuočiau. Busikas yra B kategorijos, vairuot gali.
Kodėl mes apskritai ten važiuojame?
O tai svarbu? Gal tiesiog važiuojam ir tiek, nesvarbu.
I believe we need to do a little bit more explaining as far as whether there is a civil war in Ukraine or not.
How do you define a civil war?
Is it a civil war? Is it not a civil war? It's a big mess. This is what it is.
Do you love?
Do I love what? Do I love somebody?
Да, Rokas Вишневскас и Инга Юскайте. Знаешь таких? Говорят, что волонтеры.
А почему Украина именно? Почему тут все происходит?
Мы не пришли умирать за свою страну. Мы пришли убивать за свою страну.
Лечь плaukus. Bučoju krūtīm.
Normāli.
So, as I said, the film's message can come across as ambiguous and confused, but one can also argue that this could be deliberate, because we have a perspective of sympathetic outsiders, Europeans, who are not quite sure how deeply they're invested in the conflict, whether they understand what is going on and what are the details. These are young people who, yes, come from another post-communist country, but to them, the Soviet legacy and the past imperial domination may seem as something as far removed from them. And similarly to the Western journalists who were here speaking in Dnipro in that hotel scene, they're trying to intellectually understand it, but again, they're keeping their distance. Perhaps it's a coping mechanism because it's a very traumatic place, but they're keeping their distance nonetheless. With Rokas, however, we do see a journey of transformation. This is a journey that for him is not entirely successful. It's almost exoticizes Ukraine as yet another heart of darkness in terms of where he journeys. And as in the end of the Heart of Darkness, there's the horror. But the question is, what will it do to us as viewers who are trying to understand how the message of Ukraine and the area that is struggling with the Russian aggression, but also the society at large, how it is being transformed and how the ongoing trauma of this war that still has not come to the end is continuing to inflict the wound on Ukrainian society. What would be the ways of recovery? In this sense, it's very important to have films like Atlantis by Vasinovich that Yuri was talking about, because imagining, visualizing, concretizing a world of the future where that war is over and we're building a new Ukrainian identity is a needed hopeful gesture. But not everybody has crossed that bridge, and these films are important in that they give us an insight into those people who are still struggling with those identities who have not yet found their answers, at least when we see them on the screen. But them having not found their answers could very well be interpreted and should be interpreted, I would argue, as an invitation for us, the audiences, as we interpret this film, as we make sense of it for us, to cross the bridge, to imagine that future. So the film, in the end, both films, I would say, play a positive role in pushing us to actively engage and find our answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vitaly. And it's important that we see how this subject, this war in Donbass, has inspired and driven not just Ukrainian culture, but culture outside Ukraine. And we will be speaking, Roman will be speaking about translation tomorrow, and we've talked about a little bit more about some of this literature that has been translated and disseminated outside of Ukrainian culture. So it's important to also have this aspect. Thank you.